Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm Health Business Group and host of the HealthBiz podcast, a weekly show where I interview top healthcare entrepreneurs about their lives and careers. So if you like this episode, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Well, my guest today is Ryan Jones, co-founder and CEO of Florence Healthcare. Ryan, welcome to the HealthBiz podcast.
Thanks for having me, David.
So Florence looks really exciting, and I want to talk all about that. But before that, I want to talk about how you got there, and starting at the beginning, or as far back as you want to go. And what was your childhood like, and any influences from your childhood that sort of stuck with you and influenced you to this day?
Well, gosh, I grew up as an only child, which meant I had to find my own entertainment a lot of the time, and to my parents' chagrin, I think a lot of the entertainment was taking apart appliances in their house to see how they worked. And so I spent most of my formative years, taking the vacuum cleaner apart and putting it back together and have extra parts left over. And I think that set me on a trajectory to tinker with a lot of different things, from college all the way through founding Florence with a few other amazing co-founders. So I think the most formative thing was that interest in puzzles. And I think the other thing that I was lucky to encounter was an empathetic streak, which is how we think about doing business here at Florence, always starting with the other humans that are in the room and seeing how we can make their life better or their job better, or their, in the case of our pharma and site customers, how the outcomes for their trials are better.
Taking things apart and putting them back together sounds pretty constructive. There's a lot of people I know, and they don't always mention it on the podcast, but they may have an interest like in explosions or something like that when they're grown up, which has its uses, but not as constructive as what you're doing.
Well, I have a 7-year-old, and we're trying to coach him in the right direction. But when you're 7, the explosions are often win.
Those are awesome. So, and now, what did you decide what to study in school? What was that based on?
I studied both neuroscience and engineering, and I guess it was more that tinkering idea. Half of my time was running experiments with psychology professors on people and how they perceive things, and the other half was messing around with the Formula Car team at the School of Engineering. I really couldn't get enough of those sorts of puzzles, and I guess to a degree, some of the extreme nature of it, right? When you're doing research, not on animals or on biology, but on people, and the tinkering on the engineering side wasn't just with, building bridges or engineering for engineering's sake. We got to go, 100 miles an hour when it's said and done too.
That's good. So I was both happy and sad to see your career progression. The starting point, because it had Boston Consulting Group, which is a place that was close to my heart. But it looks like you had maybe a good summer there, maybe not, but moved on from there. Did you learn anything at BCG that either good or bad that had an influence?
Well, I've learned that places like BCG and from my experience, BCG in particular, are the best in the world at describing analytical frameworks and executive communication. And so I learned a little bit about that there, but what I also learned was something about myself, which is I wanted a little more skin in the game. And so as you did in ultimately founding your own consultancy, I had decided on the exit of business school and the exit from BCG to go make a career of starting things on my own. That was perhaps the most valuable thing I got out of my tour of duty. I did learn every shortcut for nudging illustrations across a PowerPoint slide before I left, though.
Nice, that's very useful. We tried to figure out, and I won't put you on the spot here, but most of the summer consultants get a full-time offer because, for various reasons, mostly because they're good, but also because you don't want to have a bad reputation of not giving people an offer. The one way not to get an offer in the Boston office or the New York office was when you went to the pool party of the managing director. Not to drink too much that you vomit on her feet at her home pool. That is another way not to get an offer. So any
that story was told to my incoming class as a cautionary tale on like the second day we were there. So we all made sure to drink lots of water when we went to the. I was lucky to get an offer. So and I was also not lucky to vomit on anyone's shoes.
Okay, sounds good. Well, it's more than luck. It was some good planning there, and it's good to be forewarned. You know, you don't want to be the person that is the cautionary tale. It seems like they should get like a little royalty on that story if they're still telling it.
They
So,
definitely.
so before you went on and started your own stuff, you did spend some time at Microsoft, I think. What was the Microsoft experience?
Yeah, I had joined an entrepreneurial company out of business school called Fast Search that was headquartered in Oslo, Norway, and that business made enterprise search applications. So at the time, if you were to search like in the little box on Macy's or the New York Times or on Comcast, all that was powered by our technology. Google searches the web, this technology searches inside the sites. And we were bought by Microsoft, and I was lucky enough to get a spot on the Microsoft product management team after that, helping manage their SharePoint product. And so as sexy as it sounds, I became a document management human and knew how to build and market software that manages documents. Little did I know that I could use that superpower for good instead of evil one day, and that's exactly what Florence does. We're a technology company that manages all the documents that are required by the FDA in order to successfully run a clinical drug trial, like the trials that Pfizer ran to get the COVID-19 vaccines approved, or like Merck ran to get life-saving cancer therapies like Keytruda approved. All of that takes millions of pages of documents that prove that the drug is safe and effective. And sort of my nerdy days at Microsoft taking care of document management applications there, I was lucky to make into a career.
No, that sounds good. And one of the things about that you learn from a big company, I think, in addition to maybe that you don't want to work for a big company forever, is how to do things well at scale. I mean, it's it's not, you can't rely on just like a little case team of top-notch Boston Consulting Group people or something like that. You've got to design something that a regular person can run, and then it can actually work at a big scale. So with Florence, what was the inspiration to start the company? That understood you wanted to do something on your own, but why that specific direction?
Well, I've been lucky to find and partner with people who have much better ideas than my own. So, for those that are listening and are thinking about doing something entrepreneurial, I was, I think, lucky to discover about myself that I'm not the concept human. I'm the human that can take the concept and figure out how to start to build processes around it and how to sell it. And so at Florence, my co-founder, Dr. Mike Casson, was a young resident at Emory and was very motivated by a personal loss that he had to cancer. His mother died when he was in high school. And he wanted to create technologies that made research go faster, that allowed physician researchers in the clinic to spend more of their day with patients and less of their day doing scut work. And so he had the concept first focused on wearable devices. We spent a little bit of time in researching that idea. Could wearable devices advance research by leaps and bounds? But ultimately, we got excited and comfortable with the idea that the real blockage to progress in research isn't the molecule. It isn't whether the new therapy concepts or preclinical work are good. It's the mechanics of running a study is what slows down the number of therapies that reach the market every year. The stat is the EMA and the FDA, the two big regulatory agencies in Europe and the US respectively, that approve drugs, only approve about 100 new drugs every year, or devices. And about 8,000 clinical trials start every year. That's a massive funnel from 8,000 to 100. And turns out that, again, it isn't the compound that is the limiting factor. It's doing the work, and with Florence, we hope to help with the doing the work part.
Now, is Florence, where did that name come from?
There's two connections to Florence in our business. The emotional connection is my co-founder, Mike. His mother was from Florence, Alabama, so all of his research projects get a Florence title to them. But the happy coincidence is that most of the users of our software are nurses. It's research nurses, or what's also known as coordinators at trial sites. And a trial site can be a major academic medical center hospital like Partners Healthcare in Boston, or it could be your general practitioner in a clinic in a mini mall. It doesn't matter. There needs to be a physician and a team to help. But across all those research sites, and there's tens of thousands around the world, most of the folks that get the work done are nurses, and it's nice to have the connection with Florence Nightingale too.
That's good. And there's actually enough healthcare things that have the name Nightingale in them, so it's better to start with Florence. I think there's fewer Florences, but that is a good story. So you started to talk about this a little bit about sort of getting the work done and the processes that matter. But I mean, what is a clinical trial workflow in the first place, and why does that really matter?
I was shocked to learn I came from the software side of the universe and didn't come from the research side of the universe. So it was the first couple of years of us launching the business were a learning experience for me about how research works. It's crazy how many resources go into running research studies every year. The industry spends about $100 billion running clinical trial programs. Yeah. Every single year, $100 billion over and over again. And the idea is the money flows one way and the data flows back the other way. So if I'm a Pfizer or a Merck or Novartis and I have a new drug that might be a life-saving innovation in cancer drugs, I have to get that proven safe and effective before the FDA says it's okay to give out to patients. So what I do is I might hire a professional services firm called a CRO, or a contract research organization, who has thousands of people that get on airplanes and go interview trial sites that could be at your doctor's office or the hospital down the street from you to see if they have the patients and the facilities to test out that drug. So at the top of the chain is the pharma company, at the bottom of it is the patient and the hospital where they might be visiting with a doctor. And it turns out that chain is held together with people, paper, and airplanes today. So even though the industry is spending $100 billion testing the most sophisticated biologics and molecules to make people better, fax machines, scanners, and airplane tickets are still the thing that makes it go. And what we set out to do in Florence is to automate a lot of those tasks that used to require fax machines, scanners, and airplane tickets into a digital platform that allows research teams to take their day back from paperwork. And so now we're at about 1 out of every 3 trial sites around the world. We have about 1,000 studies running on our platform today at any given time, and we have about 35,000 users that spend 2 to 3 hours a day in our tool automating what used to be manual.
So help me think a little further about who the stakeholders are. So there's clearly the patient at one side, and then there's the drug company at the other side, but then there's also these other folks like the contract research organizations, the sites themselves. To say a little bit more about like what a site is and what it cares about, and how maybe having a site in the workflow makes it a little harder than certain other business processes that we might be used to.
Yeah, and that's a great observation, David. One of the reasons that the world is experiencing a bottleneck in terms of the pace of cures getting to market is that it is a complicated value chain between the pharma company and the humans that invented the molecule and all the people that are involved in proving that it's safe and effective. More complicated than other value chains that I was exposed to at Microsoft or at business school or other venues. The reason is it's hard to find patients and it's hard to find physicians that know how to run the study in a rigorous way that gives good data. So a clinical trial site is what the industry relies on, and that's actually evolving right now. We can talk a little bit about how it's evolving from a place like Partners Healthcare or Stanford or UNC Chapel Hill, and it's evolving into places like CVS Minute Clinics and Walmarts. But the traditional definition of a site is one physician who's willing to be what's called a principal investigator, and sometimes all they do is research, but more often research is an adjunct to their general clinic visit. So they may be like an ear, nose, and throat doctor that sees patients for hay fever day in and day out, but some of those patients, they say, hey, I'm running this clinical trial, do you want to get the experimental medication for this? And all of a sudden, the patient says yes, that becomes a trial site. And around the world, there's about 100,000 investigators, but at any given time, there's about 30 to 40,000 active trial sites. In order to prove a drug safe and effective, like the COVID-19 vaccine, that took 170 trial sites around the world. So there are 170 doctors at 170 locations, each managing the distribution of this experimental vaccine to patients and collecting up the data, and ultimately the pharma packages it up and sends it to the FDA for it to be approved. So that's a huge logistical challenge. Like I would say that would be in parallel with car manufacturing or running the airlines, where how does a team inside of Merck or inside of Pfizer or inside of Novartis find the hundreds of trial sites that they need to find, ensure that those trial sites can enroll patients that fit the criteria for the experiment, and then ensure that the drug gets out and the data gets collected in a robust enough way where the FDA gives it a thumbs up. It's hopelessly complicated, and what we found is that far too much of it relies on the physician staying up late with their laptop open, shuffling documents around, and our mission is to automate that thankless part so they can spend more time with patients.
Nice. And of course, if you think about how a site is different from, let's say, a vendor from a car company, something like that, is that the car company vendor, they work for Ford and GM and Toyota, but it's not a side gig making parts for the automaker. Whereas for the clinical trial site, the physician may be primarily doing NIH-funded research or seeing patients or whatever. They kind of report to their hospital, the chair of their department, and it's all the different different components of it. And sometimes they're also with like a vendor might be selected based on quality and cost. Sometimes to select the sites based on this is somebody who's going to be a key opinion leader, and they actually want them to be involved in the trial so that they can then help to promote the drug once it's approved. So I think that makes it more complex as well.
It absolutely does, and no surprise given your business, you have a very firm grasp across those complexities. I guess I'd say I'd organize it in a way, it's almost like a layer cake of complexities. There's the doctor's relationship with their practice and with the hospital, as you said, and what that's done has prevented that physician from getting access to good technology and processes in a lot of cases, because they're doing sort of everything part-time. They're caring for their patient full-time, but the research slice of it tends to be a part-time gig. So that's a problem. But the other complexity is that for a given trial, it's kind of like a movie set. Just like in a sound stage, they might move in the lights and the sound gear and the cameras and the set, but then when the movie's done, they take that all down again. In clinical trials, it's the same way. So if they decide that Dr. Smith at Sloan Kettering is the right physician to create a trial site around, they'll set up a set of resources and technologies for that doctor from Pfizer, and then when the trial's done, they take it away again. And that's part of the problem that we've been trying to solve, because for that doctor may also run 2 or 3 different trials from 2 or 3 different vendors and have to log into all these different technologies. So we made a business of starting with the sites first. The physicians can use us from study to study, and it solves that additional layer of complexity.
Nice. Yeah, I don't want to take the analogies too far about like different movie companies making movies at the same time, and sometimes the doctor will forget, or the actor will forget what movie they're in, and they'll use the wrong equipment, and then you've got to deal with that on the data side as well. So
it's not a terrible analogy. That's a part of the problem.
Yeah. So I want to, you sort of gave a very high level view of of what you do, but before we get to the role of Minute Clinic and decentralized trials and so on, what are your key offerings? Like, what do you actually have there? How you insert yourself into the workflow?
We have 2 offerings. One is the physicians are incredibly busy, as you pointed out, because not only is research adjunct to their traditional clinic work, but what's become a reality for those advancing cures for disease today is that there's a tremendous amount of administrative work. It's not just seeing the patient, taking their blood pressure and writing it down, whether it went up or went down. There's a ton of forms and qualifications that the FDA demands that the physician and her team follows. And so we make an offering that automates a lot of the documents that had to be created for the FDA, and also becomes a system of record for all the data and documents that doctor produces whenever they see a patient for that study. So they might have to put some data into the electronic medical record system per what the hospital says they have to do for their day job. But then they might take that same data and hit a button, and a copy of it will appear in our system so that it can be a single source of the truth for the clinical trial. So that's one product that we offer and that we have. We're lucky to have the best research centers in the world running on Cancer Treatment Centers of America, U.S. Oncology, City of Hope, UNC Chapel Hill, Mayo Clinic, Mount Sinai. These are all customers of ours that we've been delighted to partner with. The other thing we do is, and this only came about in the pandemic. If you think back to 2019, we were feeling very proud of the progress that Florence made in helping the physicians run clinical trials and automating that that paperwork task. But almost overnight in March of 2020, the way of the pharma companies communicating and managing those trial sites disappeared, which was putting a person on an airplane to go do an in-person monitoring or audit visit of that trial site. And so what we were able to do at the height of the pandemic was stitch together our network of trial site users across Mayo Clinic, Mount Sinai, partners, et cetera, into an access network so that a pharma company like Pfizer could then see across those trial sites and get real-time updates as to how their trials are progressing and exchange documents and collaborate with the sites that were doing the work. And that launched our second product line in the heart of the pandemic, and we were super pleased in particular to support the Pfizer vaccine study and be the system of record across those 170 sites that got that vaccine approved in record time.
There are some positive things that can come out of the pandemic. I would never say the pandemic itself is a positive thing. One of those is just the innovation in something like clinical development, which is usually fairly slow. And it's sort of funny because you sometimes would think about the regulators as being the ones that are slowing things down, but a lot of times you have people at least at the top, like I think about someone like a Janet Woodcock, who would be talking about modern ways of doing things. But then what happens is the companies themselves will say, that sounds good, but Janet Woodcock's not going to be reviewing my submission, so I better do it the same way that it was done the last 1,000 times. And when you have the pandemic where all of a sudden, guess what, there is no site in the traditional way because you can't actually, even the doctor can't go in there, then especially FDA, they weren't flat-footed. I mean, they quickly said, okay, here's what you can do to keep the trials going, and it actually sort of moved the ball along, and it sounds like you had a product ready to be able to serve that.
That's right. I would say that the FDA and to a similar but perhaps lesser extent the EMA over in Europe reacted with intention and in a positive way to allow research to continue. The thing that a lot of people don't understand that we were blown away to watch go across our software is it wasn't just about the study that had to happen to fight COVID. It was about tens of thousands of studies that were ongoing that came to a grinding halt unless there was a way to do them remotely. Every time a cancer patient who's pinning their hopes on this new experimental treatment, every time they go to get it, there's a whole realm of documentation and data tracking that has to happen when they have that visit with their doctor. And if you can't go on campus to do that, if you can't do that visit in person, if the people, paper, and airplanes that underpin the infrastructure of research fail in some way, that patient can't get that dose, and they can't continue to have hope that their cancer will go into remission. So it was super gratifying for us that during that time it wasn't just about helping the vaccine get approved, which was tremendous, but it was about seeing thousands of other studies go on and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of patients get the medicine they needed.
I remember near the start of the pandemic, it must have been even just maybe April or so, I think it was Society for Clinical Research Sites did a bunch of webinars, and they had people from China that were talking about what happened in a lockdown situation where how they were actually continuing certain trials. And the trials that were continuing, like for oncology, where they say, how did they get the drug to the patient? How did they get the data back? How did you actually make it flow? And it was just fascinating. It was frightening, but it was fascinating to see what was actually being done. So, there's traditional ways of measuring success, which I'm sure you use. What is what's your profit margin? What's the valuation of the company, and so on. But sort of from an operational standpoint and thinking about the stakeholders you work with, how do you know if you're being successful? How do you measure the success of Florence?
We think about this every day. We think that software companies have an obligation to be a force for good in the world. Unlike any other where it's easier to raise money, it's easier to build software than it's ever been before. So we have the freedom to focus on, I think, what we should focus on, which is actual impact rather than simply revenue growth. And so here at Florence, we focus on the output of research and how that translates into new cures reaching the market to help people that had no option before that medicine was available. And the metric we track is research team output. And we have line of sight that by the end of the decade, our software application will drive a doubling of research output across the research ecosystem in three ways. And so we track three metrics. One is the productivity of the research teams that exist today, the site teams that are seeing the patients. And our tool reduces their administrative burden by about 40%. If you do a stopwatch survey of how long it takes to get some tests done. The second is the redefining the definition of a trial site. So you can only complete a study that proves a drug safe and effective if you have enough patients, and you can only get enough patients if they can access something, whether that's a hospital or their general practitioner or a cancer doctor, or as you and I were alluding to earlier, like a CVS Minute Clinic. So we think the number of sites will double in that time because with the right technology, it doesn't have to be someone inside of Harvard or someone inside of Stanford that's seeing those patients. It can be a Minute Clinic. And then third, by making the practice of research less onerous for physicians and nurses. The statistic is every time there's a first-time investigator, a doctor who just decides to participate in research, 50% of the time they don't do a second study. They get burned out on the hassle of running that first study, and they don't come back and they don't contribute to the progress of research anymore. So we think we pay most attention, even though we are a for-profit business and we want a return for our shareholders, we pay the most attention to the progress we're making across those three metrics. How do we help the sites? How do we change the definition of a site? And how do we make it easier for physicians and nurses to participate in more research?
So I don't know if you picked this up in your brief time in consulting, but there's always three things. So it's good to know that that's one of our things. And in fact, sometimes you say, well, if there's only two, you say there's this one and this one. There's a third one, but it's really kind of folded into the second one or something like that. But I'm glad to hear there's three things is there. And those sound like very meaningful ones, and I'm glad that you're tracking them. I want to turn back to the personal side of things for a minute and ask, with all of what you're doing in terms of running and growing the company, do you have any time to read any books? And if so, are there any that you would recommend or any you would recommend that we avoid?
Oh, man. We should have a separate episode, David, where I bore your audience with my book enthusiasm.
Great.
Let's see. I read, it's not super exact. It won the Pulitzer Prize, so it's reached the mainstream, but it's so weird and lovely, called The Overstory. It's about, it's basically a set of characters who have some connection to a tree, and it gets into the science of the fact that trees actually talk to one another. It's wonderful. So that's, I've read that recently. And then on a business subject, I read the book called Play Bigger, which is, it tied together so many different concepts that I've encountered in my career but hadn't known how they synthesize together. And it's basically that if you're going to start a business, you should create the category that business fits in. Because if you're the leader in the category, everything gets easier. And we were lucky to do that in the first part of our business. We are the leader for site documentation software today. And we're working on being the leader for the link between trial sites and pharma sponsors as our next chapter. And we're working on that category creation with great intentionality, and I recommend that book to everyone listening.
Great. Well, those sound like two good ones, and maybe we will do a separate episode. I always just use that as a closing question. The responses range from, I don't really have time to read books, and I look at that's the one side. All the way on the other side is, I better mention this one because my husband is an author, and I got to promote his book. So you're right.
I don't have it other than enthusiasm. I have no obligations there.
Well, great. Well, Ryan Jones, co-founder of Florence, thank you so much for joining me today on the HealthBiz podcast.
Thanks for having me, David.
You've been listening to the HealthBiz podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.